Good afternoon and welcome to this episode of Bright Blue TV. My name is Joseph Silk and I'm the Communications Officer at Bright Blue. Today we are discussing class. It's Britain's biggest obsession, perhaps apart from the weather. Class endures as a defining characteristic within society. What school you went to, what job you have, how you like to spend your free time and what supermarket you shop in. It bemuses foreigners, yet it's difficult to imagine Britain without it. From the Queen to our Old Etonian Prime Minister, some might suggest that the social structure of the country has barely changed over the past 200 years. Yet the post-war period has seen tremendous progress towards greater social mobility with greater access to elite education and prestigious careers for those from more humble beginnings. Since the 1980s, however, inequality has been an increasing concern, and the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted those from disadvantaged backgrounds, such as by widening the attainment gap between richer and poorer school pupils, which had previously been in decline. Party politics, once strictly fought along socioeconomic lines, has become more blurred, with cultural attitudes and age becoming greater indicators of voting behaviour. As we strive to recover from COVID-19 and promise to build back better, can we forge what Sir John Major dubbed a classless society? Joining me to discuss this are Professor of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter, Lee Elliott Major, Lecturer in Politics at the University of Liverpool, Dr. David Jeffrey, and the Deputy Director of the Social Mobility Commission, Lindsay Turner-Trammell. Thank you all for joining us. If you'd like to submit a question to our guests, please use the Slido link in the description or tweet us using hashtag BrightBlueTV. So, Lee, big question to kick off. What is class in 2021?
Wow, what a question. A lot of people, there's a lot of academic debates about what we mean by social class. For me, it's basically your socioeconomic background, however defined. So economists would think about it in terms of income or wealth. Sociologists tend to think about sort of your parents' occupations and what they would classify as social class. Others would define it in education. Your attitude, as you were mentioning earlier, your attitudes, your views, your cultural capital, if you like. For me, it's all those things. I think to get a full picture of how background affects life chances in modern Britain, I think you've got to look at all those things. So I hope I'm not fudging this first demanding question, but I would say it's a combination of all things of those things, and that's changed over the years.
Yeah. So, Lindsay, how has the way that we define class changed over the past few decades, say?
So I think a really important distinction here is when people often talk about class, when they think about social mobility and that kind of what we often talk about as the link between your outcomes in life and where you started. So at its core, what we care about with social mobility is what family were you born into, and to what extent does that determine your own outcomes in life? Now, when we think about social mobility and we think about, has it gotten better in the UK? Is it still the same? We think about two concepts. One is something called absolute social mobility. The other is relative. Think about it as a lift. You're in a queue for a lift. When the lift, you're in a straight line going up to the lift. If more lifts start coming, more people are going to go up to the top. That's absolute mobility. So it's the idea in that kind of post-World War II boom, more jobs at the top opened up, more people were able to access professional jobs and move up the ladder. However, the placement of where you are in that queue still really, really matters. So if you were at the front of the queue, you might have gotten up the lift first. If you're at the back of the queue, you're still back there waiting in Britain. So we have this situation in the country where you do have an incredibly strong link between who your parents were and what your outcomes are, regardless of the fact that in the kind of 70 plus years since World War II, we have seen some economic booms.
So, David, you're up in Liverpool. What's the connection between geography and class? So people talk about the southeast and London as being the rich parts of the country. The government wants to push forward this levelling up agenda. Is there a link between where you live in the country and class?
Yes, I think to some extent, definitely, because what we're seeing now is in our big cities, essentially, we're seeing a lot of people who would traditionally have outlooks that we would associate with the middle class on a political level. So, they're probably slightly more socially liberal, compared to say those who live in more rural areas. But we also see them in a much more precarious economic position that we wouldn't have seen amongst some parts of the working class, traditional working class, say 20, 30 years ago. So there's an element of this precarious nature of kind of our modern economy that is reshaping what class means. And we've had this very static view, at least in political science, of we call ABC one group, the middle class, and we expect them to vote Conservative and have a more kind of affluent life in a certain set of views. And then, C2Ds, we label them working class quite lazily, and we expect them to vote Labour. And we've seen a massive breakdown of that pattern. And this is at the same time as people are moving into or more likely to live in big cities if they have certain attitudes as well as a certain economic position. So we're seeing a lot of things that are happening at the same time and that are having an impact on one another. And it's quite hard, at least in political science, to disentangle what is cause, what is effect, and what is correlation.
So yeah, you talked about the sort of voting patterns. Just going forward with that, in the Red Water, there's a lot of talk about the fact that homeowners in particular, who are traditionally associated with more sort of regions in the north and the Midlands, those traditionally to be sort of working class areas, but where people have more assets than say younger people who live in the cities, in places like London, which might be traditionally associated more with the middle. Are you sensing that change, and that the terms on which party politics are being fought is changing considerably?
Yeah, well, we're definitely seeing that. I think I don't want to preempt your later questions, but one area that England especially has been very much an outlier, I think anyway, is how it sees class as essentialist, right? So if you are this class, you will do X, Y, and Z, and if you are that class, you'll do A, B, and C. It's never been the case that the working class have overwhelmingly voted Labour. It's never been the case that the middle class have overwhelmingly voted Conservative. If it was, you would numerically never have had a Conservative government in the post-war era, right? There's not enough voters. So we know that roughly, historically anyway, around 50% to 66% of the working class would vote Labour, right? So it's always play. But we have these stereotypes, these lines that we tell ourselves in political commentary. What we are seeing now, though, that we haven't normally seen is a reshaping, very strong reshaping around age as well. And this is something that correlates with lots of other things, like Lindsay was saying, right? We've that lift metaphor. Well, guess who's back at the queue? Well, it's young voters. Why? Because of a whole range of economic processes that have happened. And it's age now that is probably one of the best predictors of how you're going to vote. Age and do you live in a big city than class probably ever has been.
Yeah, so looking more broadly again, Lee, do you think that the UK's reputation for being particularly preoccupied with class is justified?
It's really interesting, Joseph, and I want to come back to the remarks that Lindsay and David have made on politics as well. It's really interesting, more people think they're working class in this country than they are actually. When you look at other countries, David probably knows more about this than me, people tend to classify themselves as middle class. It's interesting, when I looked at some of the American data on this, now I think how we perceive middle class is probably different in different countries. That's one of the problems with it. But we do seem to have this obsession with it that seems to be maybe particularly an English thing, I don't know, but certainly that seems to be a difference between us and other countries. So I do think we're slightly obsessed about it. And so it's coming back to your question. Sorry, what was your immediate question again? So I can come back to that.
Is the UK particularly the reputation of being particularly preoccupied with class justified?
Yeah. So I would say we are, and just to add to what Lindsay and David said, the thing that our books have documented, even pre-pandemic, was this era of declining opportunity. And I hate to depress you all on a Friday midday. But all generations, as Lindsay was saying, were basically slightly better off than the previous generation since the war, and particular boom in social mobility post-war. Even before the pandemic, what we were finding was average earnings were starting to fall compared to your fathers and mothers, the generation before. And I think any political party that doesn't grasp that fundamental sort of change in society is doomed, really. So you've got to understand that there's a lot of young people who aren't able to get a house or pay for rent, that are in precarious jobs, as David was saying. And I think if you know, partly that's wealth inequality between the generations. It's driving a lot of, in my view, the voting behaviour. And in general, I think we're moving away, and again, this is probably David's specialism, but it feels to me we're moving away from ideological sort of voting behaviour to more, one of our studies showed that, for example, those who are more likely to be in areas of low social mobility were more likely to vote Brexit, irrespective of which major political party they might have voted for in the past. So there's different, in my view, there's different sort of dimensions now to voter behaviour, and that's been driven by that era of declining opportunity.
I think what you said about perceptions was really interesting. I think it was an LSE paper by Sam Friedman from earlier in the year, and he interviewed lots of different people about their backgrounds and the jobs they do now. And he found a lot of people who really are middle class in terms of their professions and their lifestyle consider themselves to be working class, because they kind of quite like the idea that they've fought against the odds and they've worked hard and they've won good careers. So I definitely think that is an important point. So Lindsay, what would you say is the state of social mobility in the UK today? Is it as bad as Lee seems to suggest?
So we at the Social Mobility Commission, for those not aware of who we are effectively a government watchdog. We are an arm's length body, and our task is to hold government to account on social mobility policy. So we look across a broad range of policy areas. It depends on what kind of time frame we're talking about here, but what I can say is that to your question, for example, on geography, does geography matter to social mobility? The resounding answer is absolutely yes. Some recent research we did called The Long Shadow of Deprivation looked at people's outcomes in different parts of the country. And we found that young people, disadvantaged young people, or working class young people, earned up to 2.5 times more, depending on what local area they lived in, compared to others with the same level of education. So what we found were there huge disparities in what people earn and the outcomes they have in life, even in the same class and with the same educational background. This indicates to us that class really matters, that geography really matters. We also found in some of these questions about perceptions and does the public care about this, we run an annual opinion poll called the Social Mobility Barometer, where we ask the public this: do you care about social mobility? What we found is that 1 in 5 adults, almost 80%, believe that there's a large gap between social classes, and only 1/3 of people in this country believe that everybody has a fair chance to get ahead when their work gets them. We do unfortunately see this in the data. From the age of 5, there are gaps based on your socioeconomic background, gaps in educational attainment, in ability, etc. Those gaps then start to widen throughout the school system, despite the sometimes Herculean efforts of teachers, of parents, of other partners trying to close those attainment gaps. And then we do end up seeing those chances. Our last State of the Nation report found that those whose parents were from a professional background were 60% more likely to end up in a professional role themselves than somebody born to working class parents.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but I was actually reading your most recent social mobility barometer earlier today, and I saw that it said that 56% of the public think that the pandemic has increased social inequality. So how worried should we be about the impact of the pandemic just very briefly, on the impact of the pandemic on social mobility?
We should be fairly worried. A lot of the trends that the Social Mobility Commission was already warning government about for years and years, saying these things are devastating. We need to be watching child poverty, educational attainment gaps, labour market disparities. A lot of these same indicators started growing during the pandemic. If you take educational attainment alone, we found that the latest and kind of best data that we have is from that first term of lockdown, so from the autumn term. By that point, the attainment gap had grown by a month. So what does that mean? That means that kids from poorer backgrounds had previously been on average about 6 months behind academically, their peers. They were 7 months behind by the first term, end of the first term of lockdown. we expect that that gap will continue to grow. So there's huge need, a huge momentum that we argue for from a policy perspective in that State of the Nation report to address some of these disparities, because they could have significant ripple effects down the line.
Can I just come in there, Joseph, quickly? Just because one of the things I worry about with these debates is that when I talk to audiences outside, particularly London and the big cities, they push back on this notion of social mobility. And I know Lindsay's not implying this, but there is in the debate a sort of very narrow view of what success is. Social mobility is about getting a professional job in a big city. And I think for me, when I was talking about that era of declining opportunity, depressing, when people talk to me, they're saying, look, I want a decent life. I want to stay in where I live, in my area of the country. I don't necessarily buy into this becoming a top lawyer or whatever the articles are about. And I just think beneath these debates are interesting. What I would say, my view is social mobility should be about your background, shouldn't determine what you want to do in your life. And the problem is, I think lots of the debates fall back into assumptions that success is high earnings. It's getting a job in a big city, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we just have to be a bit careful with that. But certainly our research is showing the pandemic is exacerbating educational and employment inequalities, which I think is bad news for social mobility.
I want to come to you now, David. So in terms of people's opportunities, I think it's an important point about not just creating a system by which people go to Manchester or London or Birmingham to get good jobs there. You want to actually use the government terminology. You want to kind of level up whole areas that people can stay where they grew up if they want to, and make a life there with plenty of opportunities. What's the best way, do you think, that we can achieve that? Obviously, education is usually taken as one of the best ways to improve social mobility and opportunities. What's your take on that?
I feel like I'm straying out of my lane somewhat, but one thing I see is when we get new students in, right, every year, and you speak to them on the first year modules, and you ask them, why did you choose Liverpool? And some of them, we have quite a large number of students who lived in Merseyside first. They want to come to a local university, but in many cases they just wanted somewhere to have an enjoyable, let's say enjoyable 3 years before they then go to, and it will inevitably be London or Manchester that they're talking about, or they want to travel afterwards. I think one of the things that stops our graduates thinking about going to, or thinking of where they can go to maybe these smaller cities or towns, or going back home, is that they just don't see opportunities there for them. And now we know that, there's agglomeration effects help drive creative industries to spurt up in new areas. So I think it's going to require things like transport, it's going to require things like housing, but it's also almost like a PR exercise from these cities themselves, of its towns, saying, we're a good place for you, right? If you don't want to go to London, if you want to have somewhere by the time you're 20, 25, 27, 28, a house with a garden, a stable career, that you can't get in London, well, this is where you can come and get it. But at the moment, it's often not even on graduates' radars that jobs exist outside of London.
Can I just come in on that quite
Absolutely.
quickly? So the Commission has also done research on kind of internal migration, or where people want to live, and how does that differ by socioeconomic background. And what we found is that those from working class backgrounds are overwhelmingly less likely to want to move, even for job opportunities, and often for really valid reasons. Some of that might be financial constraints, that it literally costs more to move to a new place, especially a big city, London, Manchester, Birmingham, etc., and that just may not be possible. But equally, family cultural reasons for staying in the place that they grew up is often a major reason that people say, I don't know anybody in London. Why would I go and take this massive risk in my life with no social support, no networks, etc.? So we're really talking to government at the moment, or as we think about what policies are going into levelling up. As Lee says, this shouldn't be about bringing everybody to be a barrister or a doctor. That's not at all what we're after. But it is after saying we shouldn't force people to move, especially if they don't want to. And opportunity should be equally distributed across the country, because talent is also equally distributed across the country. But right now, talent and opportunity are not lined up.
A bit of a controversial question, perhaps, from somebody watching, Debbie Newbury. Lee, should we abolish private schools?
So I get asked this a lot. For me, I think it's the wrong question. I think people should have freedom to choose what school their children attend. I don't think you're ever going to change that. So, my view is you have to work on improving state schools, and so it's hard. It'd be impossible to do that if you wanted to do it anyway. And so if I'm being provocative, I'd say it's about leveling up rather than pulling down. And whenever I've been involved in debates on social mobility, it seems to me that you have to argue from the levelling up perspective. Otherwise, you get into really difficult debates about stopping people encroaching on their freedom. So it's a really good question, but my view is it's about improving state schools, among other things as well. We might come on to other policies, but I think early years, for example, I still think in this country, and probably Lindsay would agree, I guess, from the Social Mobility Commission, is that we probably need more support for children, actually from when they're conceived before they start school. Because we talk about catch up in the pandemic. Schools are catching up from the age 5 when children enter the school. So I do think we need to address that. How you do that, of course, is a debate. And I think you need to look at. David mentioned the sort of precariat, the people in jobs who are in very precarious positions. I think we need to address some. I think we should have some minimum conditions as well as minimum pay in this country to enable people to get on in the workplace, as well as improving education. Last thing I'd say before handing over to the others, I do think we really desperately need a better vocational option for our children. I think at the moment we don't have that.
David, keep private schools or focus on things like early years and technical education?
I think Lee's completely right there. I don't really have much to add. I went to a grammar school in Liverpool, and it's only very recently that once you look at the evidence and you see that, well, actually the arguments that grammar schools put forward for why they should be kept are largely constantly disproven. That doesn't mean, though, I don't think that parents shouldn't be able to send their children to a grammar school if they don't want to. It is about making sure that, it's a cliche, isn't it, to say, if it was easier saying, well, all state schools should be as good as grammar schools, well, they would be already. But we've seen, the things like the London Challenge, for instance, was a really effective way of turning what were very, underperforming schools to making some of the best urban schools in kind of not just the UK, but in comparative nations. So I think we know what we need to do to make schools better, but often it's the political will, because some of the things like paying teachers more are not necessarily the easiest things to do.
Okay, I'll stay with you, David. Another political question: can we be a truly meritocratic society while we still have a House of Lords full of peers who are unelected making our laws, and also a Queen as head of state?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the thing that I don't really understand about this argument is that most people's day-to-day lives, right? The main issues around meritocracy are not, are you ever going to be monarch of, or are you ever going to be president of the United Kingdom? Well, I guess you wouldn't be the United Kingdom then, would you? You'd be the United Republic. So
the Commonwealth,
maybe yes. But I don't think that the main issues that every country has an elite, and how that elite is manifested in the day-to-day politics of a country is different to what your life chances are, whether you're born in Birmingham or Barnsley or central in Westminster, right? I think that the main thing that we can look at from a political aspect is how come over time we've seen fewer and fewer people from working class backgrounds in politics at all levels, and what does that mean for the views that are being represented? Maybe, for instance, and this is just one example, but maybe the Labour Party would have been more aware of what was happening to its traditional working class base vis-a-vis Brexit if they had more traditional working class people in, not kind of middle class sons of lawyers who went to Oxford, was a SPAD, and then went into party politics. And the same obviously applies for the Conservatives.
Yeah. Lee, David mentioned the fact that we wouldn't actually even be the United Kingdom as a country if we didn't have the Queen as head of state. How intrinsic do you think the class system is to what it means to be British? Would we be Britain without a Queen and a period and all that?
I don't think we'd be British without obsessing about class, that's for sure. And I'm sure in 100 years' time, we will be. It'll be a slightly different discussion, but it will be still there. By the way, I've got an OBE, so I can't criticise the royal family. But I agree with David. But for me, it's not that important. I know people see it as a sort of signalling the lack of, but I don't. I mean, one thing I would add to the conversation, we probably could have had a whole session on this. I do worry, and I'm writing about this soon in Times, about in the sort of diversity efforts in major companies and indeed government departments, the focus, and quite rightly in many ways, has been on gender and ethnicity. What really worries me is that social class isn't part of those diversity efforts. So I do a lot of work with big organisations, and I think these things aren't either or. I think that they're all important. But what really worries me, even though most people, or lots of people, think they're working class, actually, we don't, in our major organisations, employers, we don't focus on social class enough, in my view.
Before we come to summary at the end, Lindsay, come to you. How concerned are you about discrimination against people from certain sort of class backgrounds? I know the Social Mobility Commission does some work into discrimination in the workplace and at universities. Obviously, the Equality Act covers all sorts of different characteristics, but not class and socioeconomic status. So is that something that you think there should be more protections for?
So the Commission has called on government to look at the Equality Act, which governs that type of discrimination against other diversity characteristics like gender, religion, etc., to look at enforcing socioeconomic background as a potential characteristic. I completely agree with what Lee said. We run a program with large employers to help employers understand how to voluntarily assess and improve the socioeconomic diversity and inclusion of their workforces. So if anyone's interested, it's socialmobilityworks.org. We've got toolkits, trainings, etc. for employers. But we do see that it is a voluntary effort at the moment, because there is no kind of stick forcing. We've got the carrot side, but there's only going to be so many employers that will interact with the carrot rather than a stick. So discrimination, I couldn't necessarily comment on explicitly, but we definitely see these barriers. We had a major report earlier this year called Navigating the Labyrinth, looking at what are the career progression opportunities for those from working class backgrounds. So even once you're into a professional job, do you get on as well as those from more privileged backgrounds? And resoundingly, the answer was no. That the workplaces, even professional ones, this research was done in the civil service, tend to tilt towards culturally those from more privileged middle class backgrounds. And that tends to mean that those from working class backgrounds take longer to progress or don't progress along the same routes at all. So we still end up with those from poor backgrounds typically kind of huddled more at the lower levels of organizations and more privileged backgrounds at the top leading them. These efforts must be addressed by employers.
Okay, quick fire conclusions. Lee, how much does class still matter in the UK?
I think it still matters. I think it's ever evolving. I don't think it will ever die. And we've got to look at it to challenge. I think to do something about this, you have to look at education, but also things outside education as well. We'll be talking about this in many years to come, Joseph, when you're as old as me.
David?
I agree. I think classes, we tend to talk about class if it's one thing, but it's a merging of, economic, like Lisa said at the introduction, a merging of economic positioning and also identity. And as we see we know identity is really important, increasingly so, how people vote. And what we're going to see, I think, in the next, say, decade or so is differences between this identity of how you see yourself, these middle class people who see themselves as working class, and what that means for how they vote, but also as the economic system changes around us, how that also impacts on how class interacts with vote as well. So we're probably going to see some sort of split there, and that'll be really interesting to study. And
finally, Lindsay.
Absolutely. I think class won't cease to matter, socioeconomic background won't cease to matter until we start seeing some of these gaps actually closing. But at the moment, unfortunately, from the moment you were born all the way through to the end, to the time you're in the workforce, there are massive disparities on average across the country. And I think until some of those root causes are addressed, in ways, as we talked about, early years, vocational education, better schools, opportunities, diverse workplaces. We're going to keep hearing about this. We're going to keep talking about class.
And one final thing, Joseph. I'm just saying, the social mobility literature, there are those experts that suggest that if we don't address some of these issues, the country will eventually fracture, and we might see revolt, in might be 10 years time, but that could be the future as well.
There will be a new Cromwell and everything will kick off again. Great, okay. Well, this is such a big topic, so obviously we could go on for hours, but we'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you very much to our guests, Lee, David, and Lindsay. And thank you to those of you who are watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our channel. Our next episode will be on obesity in the UK. So have a